A year ago, a great book came out called Autonomy, and it was the quest to build the driverless car, how would it reshape our world. And I'm thinking, with an event like this, how cool would it be to have the author of this book speak to all of us? Well, guess what? You all get to find out how cool that is. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Dr. Larry Burns, the author of Autonomy.
Thank you, Charlie. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah, that dummy was named Larry. I don't know if they named it after me. Oh, he's joking. I'm glad my parents named me Larry because that's what everybody calls me, so it works out well. The famous baseball player Yogi Berra, when he retired, the media asked him, what are you going to do next? And he said he's going to finish his book. And they said, oh, you're writing a book? He said, no, I'm reading a book. But I did write a book, and it was really a lot of fun. It came out a year ago, and after the 3 months of the book launch, which is pretty amazing how much you have to work to do that, I was kind of burned out. That was about last January, and I decided I would reflect a little bit about where are we headed next, because the book Autonomy really tells the story of how we arrived at this moment. And I decided to focus on what I call the road to automobility. And part of the reason I wanted to do that is I was a little bit concerned with how the media in particular was covering our story. They seemed to see this as a race, as a sprint. They seemed to be hyperventilating every time someone in this race changed their plan or announced something different than their plan. It made headline news. And I was concerned about that because, as Charlie mentioned, my book is about a quest, not a race, a marathon, not a sprint. A long, arduous journey is really what we're doing to realize the full and exciting potential of automobility. So that's what I want to share with you today as my conclusion from that reflection. But first, let's make sure we're aligned on terminology. I see the age of automobility as autonomous electric vehicles used in transportation services, and they're going to be used in a wide range of applications. They're going to replace, in my mind, the age of automobiles, which are human-driven vehicles, combustion vehicles, which have been sold as a product. And that's a profound change. What I find fitting about our conference today is it's here in Silicon Valley because the seeds of automobility were planted by innovators. With autonomous vehicles, Google; with electric vehicles, Tesla; with transportation as a service, Uber and Lyft. And interesting, these seeds were planted during the darkest age of the auto industry, 2007 to 2012, when the company I worked for 40 years actually went bankrupt, General Motors. And what these seeds have blossomed now, and they've created a stampede with hundreds of companies and billions of dollars thundering toward this future. And it's an exciting future. It's one that not only is going to transform how we move around and how goods move around and how we interact economically and socially, it's going to give us better transportation experiences at lower cost. It has hugely attractive business opportunities and profound societal impacts. I think the question right now is, what's the road to this end, to this future? How do we get to these benefits? And what's it going to look like when we get there? And that's what I want to share with you today as my perspective on that. And I'm an engineer. How many of you are engineers here in the room? An engineer is someone who likes to work with numbers but doesn't have the personality to be an accountant. And I include myself in that group. But really, I think what's important about engineering is engineers make what's possible real. That's really what we do for a living. And transformational change is really grounded in how engineers learn. And we learn through cycles of learning. We don't go from an idea to a mature state, from no customers to everybody in one step. We do it through learning. Our ideas, we prove them out, we demonstrate them. Finally, we get a generation one product, and it's through this learning that we ultimately reach the full potential. If that potential is significant, if there really is a market, and if there really is value, I think engineers and marketers find a way to that end goal. But it's not as tidy as what you see here on this chart, but by any means. During this journey, you learn about technology, customers, operations, business models, and policies. During this journey, you get the cost lower, you get the service better, you make the market larger. But during this journey, there's a lot of false starts, there's a lot of failures, there's a lot of players who don't make it to the end. It's much more like running a marathon in the fog with an unknown route and unknown terrain than it is this nice, tidy step-by-step process. And as a result of that, there really aren't any shortcuts to following these learning cycles. I see automobility as being right on that cusp of first-generation commercialization. And we've got a lot of companies here involved in that, whether it's what we heard from Voyage and the villages, whether it's Peloton technology targeting to remove drivers in the following vehicle of a platoon, whether it's what Waymo's doing in Chandler and elsewhere, right on that first-generation launch of products. And what I want to try to help you understand is how this journey is going to play out, what's it going to look like when we get to that end game and it all matures. But first, we have to better understand automobiles, and that was my industry for most of my career. And it's pretty amazing facts. 80% of the vehicles in the U.S. are personally owned. 85% of personal travel in the U.S. is by automobile, and 88% of U.S. households own an automobile. So those are big, big numbers. And why are we so obsessed with the vehicle? I've concluded it's because automobiles provide really vast accessibility. They let us go almost everywhere whenever the need arises under a wide range of conditions. If you have a car and it's parked outside, you don't have to resolve your transportation problem every time you want to go somewhere. You just get in your car and you go. And that really is why we do something that seems irrational, which is spend $35,000 on a typical car and then leave it parked more than 90% of the time. So I think to understand the road to automobility, you have to understand not just how do I supply a better trip, it's how do I supply a broad array of transportation use cases, this vast accessibility. And I want to show you with this road to automobility how I think that'll play out. Now, we had some great discussion earlier. Elaine, thank you very much for leading that about these 5 levels or 6 levels of autonomous vehicles. As an engineer, I actually felt they were quite liberating. I thought they were ingenious from Society of Automotive Engineers and NHTSA. I don't even think about level 5. It's not even on my radar screen. In fact, I'll argue in a minute, I don't think we even need to ever think about getting to it. But I find level 4 to be really, really profound because it allows us to perform safety-critical driving functions in defined use cases. So if you define those use cases, you can geofence the things you can't do. They're out of bounds and only do those things in those areas at those times under those conditions that you know you can safely do, safely critical. And so I think this has been very liberating. And it allows us to think about the road to automobility then in terms of both trips and accessibility. The Generation 1 market, if you look at this total blue circle, that's everything. That's all the trips we take on the surface, road transportation, with all modes. And in Generation 1, the geofence market's going to be pretty small. There's not going to be a lot of trips served with that first generation, but it gives us a learning cycle. And it means all these other modes, walking, biking, scooters, cabs, buses, Uber, Lyft, Maven, everything else remains very important and very relevant because that's how we'll get around. Certainly, this isn't going to get you out of your car and convince you don't need a car. But when we get to Generation 2, because we've made this lower cost in Generation 2, we've made it better service, we've broadened our use cases, you're going to have more trips and more accessibility. And then Generation N, and then finally at maturity, you realize this self-sustaining growth dynamic is going to take us to this point where we literally can compete with personal car ownership. Notice that outer blue ring on the mature age of automobility. It's quite thin. That's still going to be with human-driven modes. Those are those niche modes or those use cases that we just haven't figured out a way to handle yet. And that's just fine. And there's an industry that we can model after, and that's the aviation industry. Because there are certain times and weather conditions and places we can't get to when the weather doesn't allow us to do it. It's geofenced in a sense. So I think this is a very, very important road to automobility. And the epiphany I took from thinking about this is that the safety leader will be the market leader. So there's a lot of hand-wringing. Are there wildcatters out there? Are these companies going to, in the pursuit of greed, do things that are irresponsible to launch autonomous vehicles before they're ready? I've become convinced that if you want to lead this, that the quest for autonomous vehicle leadership is really a quest for safety leadership, and here's why. The safety leader will be able to serve more use cases than their competitors. They'll provide greater accessibility, a larger market share of those trips, and they'll be able to, very importantly, learn faster. Also, the safety leader will be able to make more refined autonomous driving decisions. And we only make two of them. Which way do we steer and how fast do we go? And the better and more confident I am with my autonomous driving system to make those decisions, the higher the quality of the ride, which will give you a larger share of the trips and premium pricing. So I think this is a real important takeaway, is if the quest for AV leadership is a quest for safety leadership, that's exactly the way it should be, that the market's going to drive safety leadership. And I'm excited about that. I feel I owe this audience and others my take then as I reflected on what will this mature age of automobility look like. Now, this is conjecture. I really don't believe in forecasts, and you can take all the economists in the world and lay them end to end, and they'll never reach a conclusion. So I'm not trying to do an econometric forecast. I'm just trying to connect the dots as I see them. It's my best foresight at this time. I know I'm going to be wrong in some ways, but I want to share these 6 features with you just to give you a sense of where I think the road to automobility will take us. First, it's going to be significantly safer than automobiles for all road users. I think that's important for all road users, significantly safer. And much like the journey we've taken with aviation, once it matures, safety will be the price of entry. It won't be the basis of competition, but en route, it'll be a basis of competition. Second, transportation services using autonomous electric vehicles will provide nearly all trips. And as I showed earlier, today, personally owned cars that are human-driven with combustion engines are providing most all of the trips. And we're going to have differentiated market segments. Third, the riders will subscribe to transportation services, and they're going to pay for vehicle use by trip, hour, day, week, month, or year. So I came to this conference via Uber. I paid for exclusive use of my ride for one trip. Other people may want to have something equivalent to a lease and have their own exclusive autonomous vehicle for a couple years. They're not going to own it. I think they're going to subscribe to the business. Next, vehicles will be owned and managed primarily as fleets. Today, they're owned by ourselves. The customer experience, the service quality, and the cost per mile will be what we compete on. And operational excellence will be essential. Believe me, the day-to-day stochastic nature of transportation is such that running transportation services is really, really hard. Stuff happens. You get ice on the road, you have traffic jams, all kinds of things happen. You have to be an extraordinary operator to do this. The vehicles will be tailor designed. They'll be ultimate riding and logistics machines, not ultimate driving machines. I think they'll all be battery and fuel cell electric, optimized for cost per mile. And then finally, and very, very importantly, they're going to be sustainable for future generations, which is hugely important. So this is a very different world than what we've lived in for the last century. And I think when you connect the dots, it's a very exciting world. So if you believe, like I do, that automobility is inevitable, my advice is to get in front of the inevitable. You're going to be better off being prepared than being left behind, even if you end up preparing yourself earlier than what hindsight would have led you to conclude. So I really think you need to get in front of this. It's sort of like, I was talking to my wife the other night. I said, if anything ever happens to me, do you think you're going to get remarried? And she said, nah, I couldn't do that. And I said, well, I'd be gone, and you're still young. She says, okay, I'll think about it. I said, if you get remarried, you're going to let this guy have my car. I've got this Cadillac XLR convertible. And she said, no, that's your pride and joy. And I said, well, I'd be gone. The car would be in the garage. It just makes sense. She said, okay, I'll think about it. I said, what about my golf clubs? And she said, oh, no, he's left-handed. So she's getting in front of the inevitable, which is fine. But I think it's critically important that we think about it this way. And here's really sort of the last key point I want to make today. Why are we doing this? Sometimes as I reflected on it and I read the media coverage and all this excitement and big headlines and stuff, I think sometimes we forget, what are we trying to do? What is our purpose? And I think it's these societal impacts are so profound. We talked before about eliminating 90% of the crashes, which is a big deal. I think we can get off of 80% of the demand for oil. Now, if you're Saudi Aramco and you're trying to do an IPO, you probably don't want to hear that, because that might mean a future of $20 oil, not $80 oil, but I think it's definitely possible. People who can't own or operate a car can have better accessibility. Climate change and air pollution, transportation, that can all be mitigated, and substantial amounts of land and structures and all of that can be repurposed from parking, and roadway throughput could be increased. What worries me about this is these are big, big goals, and I think they're all attainable simultaneously, but there are some headwinds. There are people with vested interest in the century-old age of automobiles that don't want this to happen, and they're jumping on events and spinning them so that there's a lot of people out there having premature judgment about what autonomous driving is all about. And that does concern me. That's why communication and conferences like this are so important. The other big concern, obviously, the jobs impact. My home city, Detroit, is focused on the UAW-GM strike, and that, in my opinion, strike is all about not right now, but this future where vehicles are going to have half as many parts in them and last twice as long as we've seen in the past. So let me wrap up. The age of automobility is a transformational opportunity. There's no question about it. I think substantial progress has been made. Every time I ride in an autonomous vehicle, and to be open, I'm an advisor to Waymo, I get to do it fairly frequently, I come away really impressed with what the vehicle can do, not just fixated on what maybe the vehicle didn't do on that ride. Great progress. It's learning that's going to get us there. This is not going to be a yes, no, a switch on or off. It's going to happen through learning cycles. The safety leader will be the market leader, which I think is really reassuring for all of us. I think very importantly, innovation in this space is in its infancy. I have the opportunity to engage with a lot of startups, sensor startups and all of this stuff. This is just getting started. There's so much excitement for people who want to get in this game and get to the next generation learning. It's a disruptive change, so there's going to be pushback. I think it's inevitable, so you've got to get in front of it. And I'll tell you, just enjoy the ride. I was joking about my wife before. We've had a great relationship, and you just got to do those things. Like the other night, we were having wine out on our deck. It was a beautiful evening, and it's just so relaxing. And suddenly she goes, "Oh, I love you, I love you." And I said, "Is that you talking or the wine talking?" She said, "It's me talking to the wine." So this is me talking to the wine. Thank you for having me.
Larry, a pleasure. Thanks for doing that. Really a pleasure. I'm glad I'm not left-handed. Seriously, I didn't really give you much of an intro on Larry, and I hope you realize what a great impact he's had on the industry. Just a couple phrases from his book, which isn't his first one, by the way. He did another great book on transportation. He talks about the size that fits the need of the journey. And anyway, he was the Vice President of Research and Development and Planning at General Motors for years. I first met him in 2002 when he introduced the skateboard at the Detroit Auto Show. Again, professor, University of Michigan, engineering practice, and of course on the board, as he mentioned, Google, Slant, Waymo, and also I think you do some work with Peloton out here. So thanks so much for sharing with us today.